Shrinkflation is one of the most important and also one of the most difficult things for people on Main Street, the average Joe and Jane, to understand and to prepare for. And we have a little case study here with a news clip that was actually done by a local TV station in Brisbane in Australia. And then I'm going to compare it with the consumer price indexes from Australia for the food prices and show you stagflate, tax, lie, how in real time it's not covering it. The truth is much, much different than the reality of what the consumer has to deal with at the grocery store, when they're buying consumer staples, food, and all of these. This is going to be an extremely short live stream show. This is not going to be a long show. Very, very short. Okay, so let me play this clip. And it's a minute 30 seconds long from 7 News in Brisbane. It just came out in the last week or so about shrinkflation.
It's the sneaky strategy employed by the giants of the food industry, so-called shrinkonomics, catching out unsuspecting shoppers.
We often find that as food prices go up, food manufacturers need to reduce the contents.
And it's
So they have to pass on the costs. It's all about profit margins. If they don't figure out a way either to maintain their profit margins, they're going to go bankrupt too, especially with a lot of these food companies, the older, stodgier food companies like Kellogg's and some of those other ones. They've used an enormous amount of debt on their balance sheet for financial engineering for years. But shrinkflation has been a very common theme here in the United States, in the United Kingdom. I believe the Office of National Statistics in the United Kingdom is probably the only government agency that is accurately detailing shrinkflation in incredible detail. Actually, there's I think an annual shrinkflation report that's come out for a few years now, where they show with pictures and analysis, like the size of candy bars, the size of other food items, how much they have shrunk. But pretty much every other government is in stagflate, tax, lie mode, lying about how much inflation.
difficult to spot. Take Cadbury family-sized chocolate blocks, once 250 grams and now 180. Smith's crisps were 200 grams, now 170. And Kellogg's cornflakes boxes have been reduced by 70 grams, while the price remains the same.
Unfortunately, that's a part of the contents reduction strategy, or the shrinkflation strategy.
Supermarket giants have also shrunk products to advertise that they have lower prices than competitors. And experts predict more shrinkflation.
Product shrinkage has been an evolving trend over the last decade. It's been accelerated since the onset of the pandemic in January, February of this year.
But guess what? The Australian Consumer Price Index doesn't reflect any of this. The Consumer Price Index, and it's supposed to be updated tomorrow, ironically, on October 28th, but the Consumer Price Index in Australia fell 1.9% this quarter. Over the 12 months to June 2020 quarter, the Consumer Price Index in Australia fell 0.3%. The most significant price fall was childcare at minus 95%. The most significant price rise was tobacco prices at 2.7%, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And food and non-alcoholic beverages were basically flat from March to June. So 0.5% increase according to the government data. And the quarter change, the year-over-year change from June 2019 to June 2020 was only a 4.1% increase in price for food and non-alcoholic beverages. So this is not reflecting the reality. So stagflate and tax and lie is meant for governments so they can, quote unquote, fight deflation, so they can lower interest rates, devalue currencies, and try to just flood the system with new currency and credit, because they're fighting deflation. They're trying to save us. Can't you understand that? Only selfish people talk about shrinkflation. Only stupid and selfish people talk about deflation. I'm being sarcastic, by the way. Okay, let me get back to the rest of the video.
As from the experts, always read the fine print, shop around for a bargain, and if you can, buy home brand instead.
Experts also recommend comparing the unit pricing, the cost per 100 grams, as shown on the price tag on the shelf.
Keep an eye on the weight that's printed on the pack size, and has it been reduced since last time you shopped?
Or you could be paying for a whole lot of air. Samantha Brett, 7 News.
And that is a common mistake. People don't check the weight. People don't check the cost per unit. There's a lot of people that tell me, oh, the price hasn't changed, Jason. You don't know what you're talking about. But if you listen to the conference calls, Chipotle Mexican Grill has admitted their portion size has drastically been reduced. So when I was in college and I used to go to Chipotle Mexican Grill, because it's a good place for college students to go because it's not that expensive, and used to be able to get a lot of grilled chicken or grilled steak or pork carnitas or barbacoa. Used to be able to get meat for a reasonable price, and used to get a lot of scoops of meat for a very low price. But now it's a lot less scoops compared to the past. And this is for the average Joe and Jane out there. You're going to be able to understand inflation, understand shrinkflation way, way better than anyone with a PhD in economics who hires interns, or probably unpaid interns, because it's probably here in the Washington, D.C. area. It's probably a college student at George Washington University or Georgetown or American University, one of the top universities here, probably Georgetown or George Washington, though, who's going to be assigned by the Federal Reserve Bank or the Bureau of Labor Statistics to go to Walmart, to go to the grocery stores, to go to Target, and all they're going to do is just record the prices at what the consumer pays. They're not going to take a look at, is this a lot less portion size of the food? Has the price stayed basically the same, or maybe it's up 10 cents, but the amount of the food or the amount of the consumer staple item is down 20, 30, 40, 50%. And this is the case of what's happened over the years. My point here is you have to have a baseline to compare. So it's very similar to what a doctor does with baselines, with measuring certain blood pressure and other statistics about people or how well they're breathing. But in terms of measuring inflation, the average Joe and Jane is going to be able to measure inflation in your own personal budgets way, way better than a PhD in economics ever will. So if you eat at the same restaurant for years, like what I have done with my best friend at this grilled chicken place called Nando's Peri Peri Chicken for 5 years, and you order pretty much the same food all the time. So it's like a grilled chicken wings platter. So it normally is 24 grilled chicken wings that are marinated, so they're very juicy and plump. And what has been happening over the last couple months, and the portion size has changed a lot. We went in there this past weekend. The chicken wings were down in size over 50%. So normally it is very difficult for 2 adult males to finish a giant grilled chicken wings platter of 24 grilled chicken wings. They're very large. And then they changed the portion size. Enormous shrinkflation. The price did not change, by the way. The price was the same. So the price stayed the same, and the portion size dropped at least 50%. So the chicken wings, they switched to much tinier chicken wings with very, very little meat on them. And the government statistics either are not going to cover this because they're not doing it correctly, or it's intentionally not covering it. And both ways are disturbing. So it doesn't matter if they're intentionally lying it or they don't know how to cover it accurately, because I just get in arguments with tons of deflationists and they're like, oh, I don't know, the prices are the same. The prices seem pretty reasonable to me, but you don't have a baseline to compare things against. So if you eat at the same restaurant a lot and you're paying pretty much the same price, or the price doesn't go up, and then all of a sudden the portion size is shrunk 20, 30, 40, 50%, that is shrinkflation. And my point here is that the government statistics in all these countries, it is in their incentive to lie about this. Why? Because then the government, then the central banks get to do more stimulus. They get to create more currency and credit. If the narrative is that they're fighting deflation is the enemy, and deflation is not really the enemy. Okay, George Gammon has talked about this a lot. In the Austrian School of Economics, tons of consumers, tons of people without debt benefited from deflation for many, many years in capitalism. Francisco, this is not capitalism. This is what the companies have to do to survive too. Otherwise, the companies go bankrupt. So yeah, if you're just going to blame it on capitalism, it's really ignorant on your part. It's more complicated than that. This is currency devaluation. You have all these countries devaluing currencies. I talked about, I'll do another show on this, about all the countries that have had massive currency devaluation since February and March. And it's going to leak into the global supply chains. And it's going to cause shrinkflation. It's going to cause higher costs in supply chains. So while these government statistics are screaming about deflation, you're starting to speak to people who actually manufacture goods. They're starting to see their costs rise. Cheap oil does not guarantee cheap goods on everything. Okay, in oil, energy input costs, cheap oil only means cheaper transportation costs, or if it's like plastics or something, it does not guarantee cheap costs. I've heard people say, because oil is cheap right now, that means there cannot be any inflation. I've heard people say that. And you are clearly not familiar with how goods are manufactured, especially if politicians are going to force wages higher. Because we're hearing this now. A lot of politicians talk about, Joe Biden was talking about this in the debates last Thursday, that minimum wage laws must be raised, even during the pandemic. Is that fair to small business owners? Is that capitalism? If a politician or a bureaucrat forces wages higher, is that capitalism? But capitalism will be blamed. I can guarantee you it'll be blamed by most people. I have friends that were not socialists or communists 10 or 15 years ago when I went to college with them, and now they are. They haven't done any reading or anything. They're just lazy, and they just want to blame everything on capitalism. And now they're socialists or communists. Rob says, look at the price of the new carne asada bowl. Is that at Chipotle Mexican Grill? And for double meat at Chipotle, for the extra like $2.50 here in my area, that extra meat cost is you're paying, that's the portion size of what you used to get 10 years ago on the regular meat portion. So that's it. None of the government statistics for inflation are accounting for any of this. So you have a situation now to buy votes and to redistribute wealth, where politicians and bureaucrats are promising higher wages during a pandemic when a small business owner clearly can't afford higher costs. Is the small business owner going to be able to pass along the cost to their customers? Maybe. Most likely it'll be some form of shrinkflation then. So the menu price either is going to go up slightly or it'll go up a lot, but then the portion size is going to decrease if it's a restaurant. And why do I talk about restaurants so much? Because the majority of Americans, about 70% of American jobs are service sector. And the majority of the U.S. economy is based on consumption, which is service oriented. So that's why I talk about service sector jobs in restaurants. Because a lot of Americans who just graduated college, young adults, they work in the service sector. Or at least they used to before the pandemic. I mean, if they're just going to hand out MMT stimulus, and I'm using air quotes here, checks, it's going to get really messy. So unfortunately, I expect a lot more shrinkflation. And then people are just going to blame capitalism. But the companies have to do this to survive. They either have to figure out, if you're a restaurant owner, I've heard stories for years now, how restaurant owners have been substituting items. So if you order if you're at a barbecue restaurant or a Cajun restaurant, or Southern restaurant, and you order meat chili, there's hardly any meat in it now. It's mostly beans. Because beans are cheaper. That's just the new normal. And it's going to get worse before it gets better. I have a super chat here from Dmitry Shmerkovich. Thank you for the $10 super chat. He is also a Patreon account contributor. He says one of over 1,000 per month for only $5 a month. If you want to take a look behind the paywall, there is a lot of great content behind the paywall. He says, Jason, thank you for all of your hard work. Speaking from my he lived in the Soviet Union, his Soviet Union experience, nothing topples empires faster than food price inflation. I agree. And this is why China, the Chinese Communist Party, is so worried, and they are importing food at record paces. And they're claiming that they've had bountiful crops despite the record rains and flooding in certain parts of China that were the worst in 70 or 80 years, despite the droughts in certain parts of China, because they know exactly like what you said, Dimitri, that if there is riots in the streets in China over food prices, over soaring vegetable prices, grain prices, meat prices, that will get the people going faster than anything else. So that is why the Chinese government is importing insane amounts of meat and grain and vegetables from all over the world. And it was this way before the pandemic because they had the African swine flu for all of 2019. So yes, I totally agree. If people's bellies, and this is why Franklin Delano Roosevelt was making promises, right, about a chicken in every pot. He wanted to rewrite the Constitution, I think, at one point, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So not only did he, the demigod that hardcore Democrats worship, and I don't like FDR. FDR and Woodrow Wilson were the two worst presidents in U.S. history in the modern era, by far. Woodrow Wilson and FDR were absolutely horrible. But besides debating packing the Supreme Court and violating the Constitution many times, FDR also debated rewriting the Constitution and including like guaranteed health care, a chicken in every pot food, because he knew exactly like what you said, Dimitri. He wanted to make sure that people were fed. And if people are well fed, the odds of revolt are much lower. Okay, that's it for this live stream show. I want to thank everyone for listening. Want to take a look at my other content? There is an enormous amount of content on my YouTube channel. Also, there's, I think, over 120 pieces of unique content behind the paywall on Patreon for only $5 a month. No one offers the price point that I do for that type of content. And I'm starting to see a lot of the analysis show up on Seeking Alpha too, which is ridiculous.